Welcome to our third webinar in our Return to Play series. We're happy you're here with us today. Our series is designed to help give coaches, trainers, athletes, and others in the exercise science field the knowledge they need to help keep their athletes or themselves safe and healthy as they return to play post-pandemic restrictions. This webinar is being recorded and will be made publicly available, so those who wanted to attend today can still view our webinar. Today, we are discussing coaching recreational sports in a post-COVID world with PhD candidate Todd Gober. So a little bit about Todd. Todd Gober is a PhD candidate with Concordia University Chicago's Leadership in Health and Human Performance program. His current dissertation, titled Recreational Triathlon and COVID-19, A Predictive Interpretation, focuses on COVID-19's impact on recreational triathletes. While initially holding a background in engineering, he found his passion in exercise science when he became dedicated to transforming his own health and began training and competing in triathlons. He has spent 11 years as an endurance athlete and has served as a personal trainer and a USA Triathlon Level 1 certified coach. As previously mentioned, he is a PhD candidate at Concordia University Chicago, which is one of our hosting universities for this webinar series. A little bit about Concordia University Chicago. Concordia offers bachelor's, master's, and doctoral programs in exercise science. The courses are 100% online and asynchronous, which means you can balance work, school, and your family or personal life. You can complete your master's in 12 to 18 months. There is a 50% transfer credit available for students, and CUC has a tuition guarantee, which means your tuition won't change on you while you're studying with them. If you're interested in any of these programs, please feel free to message me directly. A few final housekeeping notes. We will have time for questions at the end, but if you have any that come up during the webinar, please feel free to speak up during the presentation or put anything in the chat. On that note, I'll pass things over to Todd.
Hey, thank you, Naomi. Hello, everyone, and thanks for spending your lunch with us today. My dissertation focus has been on the recreational triathlon community, specifically from the COVID-19 impacts. However, it's recreational triathlon, recreational sports in general, they transfer very easily. So what we're going to speak about today is as coaches and trainers and athletes, it's important that we understand the potential pandemic impacts to adult recreational athletes to assure a safe and injury-free return to play. So the presentation that I'm going to provide is going to give scientific evidence. It's going to get quite a bit of science information involved. But what we want to do is identify and explain what those impacts could be and what does that mean to an adult recreational athlete who's returning to play. And especially as a coach or as a trainer, what impact does that have on us as our responsibility to help them migrate back to a playing lifestyle. So what I'd like to do is focus in on three areas specifically where the pandemic has impacted adult recreational athletes. We're going to speak about the athlete's health and well-being. I'm going to speak about the athlete's endurance performance. As Naomi mentioned, I'm an endurance athlete, I'm a triathlete, but I'm also a coach in triathlon, but I do coach marathon runners and I do swimming and also cycling as well. So, and then we're going to finish off by, I'm going to kind of provide you with a suggested return to play protocol, something that perhaps could help you guide you as you are mentoring and assisting your athletes back to play. So, there's no doubt that we can speak about the emotional impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic for some time. But what I wanted to do is there's a piece of evidence that I wanted to bring up, and this was on a research study that I discovered specifically where in the absence of these live competitions, and as a recreational athlete, you know, we had suspended mass participation sports were suspended across the world. So how much of an impact did that have on an athlete? Well, on the elite level athletes, we can imagine it had a tremendous amount. Now, on recreational triathletes or recreational athletes, the same amount, truthfully, could be experienced as well. So it's important that we understand what those restrictions meant to our athletes as they return to play. So in one specific research study, evaluated 18 elite athletes, the evidence found that the most impactful experienced motion that they experienced was their imbalance, basically their management strategies. They had a difficulty between physical and mental training. So the author also noted that, the athletes spent more time with their families, and that was both good and bad, as we can all imagine. But they noted that, the emotions specifically of anxiety, not knowing what that future held for the athlete, not knowing, if they were going to be infected, how that impacted their sport. They don't know that. So that was anxiety that they experienced, but also anger. The anger that they experienced, that these athletes experienced, was due to the competitions being canceled. So that translated to a desire, a longing for the old competitive lifestyle. So what does that mean? What does that mean to us as coaches and triathletes? So what that means is that this emotional impact that we all have experienced, that translates into a mental, psychological desire, if you will, when you return to sport, to perhaps have a little bit more enthusiasm as a return to play. What that translates to is you've increased your risk of injury. So as coaches and triathlete, or coaches and trainers, we've got to recognize that many of our athletes are going to want to just really jump right back into it again. At least that's been my experience so far. So what we have to do is manage their return to play, RTP, manage that enthusiasm as they return to play to prevent injury. So in addition to the emotional impacts that the pandemic have had, we need to speak about the financial impacts. And quite honestly, this does impact the return to play. We all know, it's expensive to play, especially as you get into certain sports. Triathlon specifically can be very expensive. What I wanted to show or share with you is a research study that I came across, where the authors evaluated or received responses from 141,000 people during the pandemic. So it's a rather large study. 57%, over half of them, reported being negatively impacted by the pandemic. So either they lost their jobs, they had to live off a good portion of their savings, even the retirement investments were impacted. All of this translates to negative or impacted global spending behaviors. Basically means that they have less disposable income. So as a coach and as a trainer and as an athlete, we have perhaps may have one of our clients or athletes may not have the money that they had before. So what does that mean? That just means, quite honestly, they don't have enough money to, pay you, pay me. So you may have to be cognitive of maybe doing pro bono work. They may not have money for facilities. Even entry fees can be very expensive when you play in recreational sports. Equipment costs can be very costly. So as a coach, we should be mindful that the athlete probably or may have experienced some financial difficulties, and they simply may not be able to go to the gym and work out anymore. So we need to work with them as they return to play safely. Two more items I'm going to speak about. First would be nutrition. Certainly the pandemic impacted the nutrition of athletes, the recreational athletes. So it brought up additional health concerns. Not only did the virus bring up concerns, but just the impact of the pandemic brought up additional health concerns, and the fact that improper eating behaviors, limited access to healthy foods. In a study of 1,100 people, they discovered that altered eating behaviors and patterns were observed through increased number of main meals. So they ate, the volume of food was a lot more, they ate a lot more. And they also snacked a lot more on that unhealthy food. Essentially, what this means is that the healthy eating behaviors decreased by 32%, binging, it increased by almost 50%. So this is significant as we talk about athletes. Alcohol consumption also increased significantly during the pandemic. So again, as we are working with our athletes, bringing them back safely and transition them back to play, we need to be mindful that we have to address those poor behaviors. Those may have not been there previous, but now they are. So we need to be mindful of poor behaviors, address those poor behaviors, specifically in the eating behaviors, in order to prevent injury. Also want to look at what does all this translate to? Anthropometics. So in addition to the limited access to the training facilities, the unhealthy eating behaviors, during the home quarantine specifically, this research study found that the physical activity decreased by 45 minutes per week on average. So if you think about the general public, they were physically inactive 45 minutes more per week, while they sat more, increased basically 3 hours per week. So what that translates to, unfortunately, is that 79% of those respondents reported gaining body weight and having extra body fat. So what does that mean? That basically means as us as coaches and triathletes, or as coaches and trainers, that we've got to be aware that the anthropometric changes to the physiology have to be addressed. So it's quite honest, maybe necessary for you to perform health and fitness assessments in order to prevent injury. I'm going to speak more about that here in just a little bit. So those were the athletes' health and well-being impacts. And I bring those up because those need to be addressed as coaches and trainers. Certainly, we want to talk about the impacts to an athlete's endurance performance. What happens to us physically when the pandemic hit? What are we doing? We can't do anything. Inactivity, increases. We're eating more. We're just sitting around getting fat, right? So what does that do to us physically? As an athlete, someone who is used to training their body, and yet suddenly they've been hit with this. So what happens to those, to the body? There's three areas specifically I'm going to look at, three body systems that I'm going to focus in on. First is going to be the cardiovascular system. And of course, the cardiovascular system consists of the heart, the vascular network, and the blood itself. The benefits from training, again, that endurance, aerobic, routine, exercise lifestyle that that the athletes enjoy and the recreational athletes live, that being impacted, right? So this is kind of going to have some sort of impact on our cardiovascular system. But the training that we have worked at there's abundant evidence, well documented, that aerobic endurance exercise enhances the structure and the function of the cardiovascular system through increased blood volume, simply getting more blood into your working muscles, decreased blood pressure, specifically the diastolic blood pressure is decreased. So that's the amount of pressure that's still on your heart between beats. So that's the part where it's the decreased blood pressure impacts the amount of stress that's on your heart while it's doing nothing. And then there's myocardial ventricular hypertrophy. So basically that's the increased stroke volume. So your heart muscle gets really stronger through aerobic exercise. So that means that ventricular contraction, that muscle gets bigger and bigger through hypertrophy. So that means more volume of blood is pushed out. And then what that translates to is a stronger endurance performance, right? So aerobic endurance exercise to the cardiovascular system helps improve our immunity because we increase the blood cell volume, the red blood cell volume, through increased plasma. So certainly as we are in an era of COVID-19 and we're trying to prevent measures and be mindful of our behaviors to prevent infection, immunity right now becomes important. So benefit from exercise is that we are more immune. It enhances our immunity. So as we looked at the benefits of the training, so what is the detraining, if you will? What happens when the impact of the pandemic? What did our bodies experience in cardiovascular? So we call that detraining. So basically stopping, or even a slight interruption in the exercising rhythm, the routine that you have had, just a slight interruption, you can start seeing a detraining effect. Remodeling, or the length of that interruption that you experienced and its effects on athletes, it differs between athletes. So a remodeling, if you will, cardiovascular remodeling takes place, but it depends on which athlete, your level of your fitness and the cardiovascular physiology of that athlete. But for example, I brought up a couple of points here, and I wanted to kind of signify or kind of use this to stress this. So if we look at an Olympic athlete who is basically does this their whole life, this is their life. In a research study, of a specific detraining prescription, so they agreed to be studied for their detraining effects. So it took 13 weeks for an Olympic athlete to experience or to present decreased ventricular hypertrophy. So again, that's that stroke volume. So it took 13 weeks for that evidence to show up. Compare that to a recreational athlete, okay? And in this case, we're going to look at marathon runners. And in this study, it was Boston Marathon runners. Following the Boston Marathon, these runners underwent a specific detraining prescription, and it took within basically 8 weeks, they saw a diminished remodeling through decreased ventricular hypertrophy, as well as a reduction in plasma volume, and they saw a 5% increase in their maximal heart rate. So you can see where the cardiovascular remodeling takes place differently depending on that level of conditioning they had going into the detraining period. So we look at this, and I bring this up simply because as we are now helping in coaching these athletes back to a safe way of playing, we need to be mindful. There has, quite honestly, potentially been an impact to their cardiovascular system. So just recognizing that it takes a methodical plan to return to a safe level of play. And we'll share that here in just a little bit. But anyway, that's a neat contrast. I want to focus in now on that second physiology system, and that'd be the respiratory system. Now, we talk about the respiratory system, we're talking about the lungs and the diaphragm, the bronchial tubes, and the capillaries, and specifically the capillaries. We'll talk about that. Basically, the respiratory system converts oxygen to carbon dioxide, okay? Before we get into the pandemic effects necessarily, I want to talk about the actual COVID-19 virus effects, and that's going to be the health aspect. And this is kind of recent. I want to bring this up because as a recent respiratory virus, the chronic health effects remain unknown. So that's still, right now, we're in that phase in athletics and in sports. We're trying to really, we're seeing evidence for the first time. A lot of this based off of athletes who have been infected with COVID-19. So in a recent article, the Journal of American Medical Association published, they shared an article where the American Heart Association, the American Medical Society of Sports Medicine had combined to do some research, and the preliminary evidence data suggests that 1 in 5 athletes, and this is specifically college athletes, may present myocarditis, which is a heart inflammation. Okay, so as the athletes presented abnormal heart rhythms. Yeah, so if abnormal heart rhythms are showing up in 1 in 5 college athletes, that raises some concerns, because specifically these were the ones that were COVID-19 infected and recovered, and they're starting to see this. there's some concerns this could be linked, of course, to sudden cardiac death. I bring this up only to you. Please, as you're helping and working with your clients and you're training them and your athletes, please realize we still don't know really that long-term effect of what COVID-19, the actual virus, had. And so the preliminary evidence is suggesting. So the NCAA, I know, has got a lot of focus right now, attention on this, but I want to bring that up simply because it is something of significance as you coach your athletes. Now, when we talk about the detraining, what happens when your body goes through a period like we came through where we were doing nothing? So a lot of things happen, and I'm going to focus on two things specifically. VO2 max, the maximum volume of oxygen that your body can intake, utilize, convert, and exhale, right? So this is maximum level of performance. And this is where the volume of oxygen was shown to decrease within 2 weeks of basically of detraining. And let me see if I can find my notes. There it is. And what that resulted from was, as we talked about a minute ago, was that decreased ventricular hypertrophy, that stroke volume decreased. Well, what that does is that decreases the amount of oxygenated blood that can be delivered to the working muscles, okay? So the VO2 max drops within 2 weeks. In another study, it shows that within 4 to 8 weeks, and this was of endurance cyclists, okay, within about 4 to 8 weeks, they showed a significant reduction in the number of capillaries. So what's the capillaries? The capillary is where the actual conversion points, the point of conversion where oxygen is converted to carbon dioxide, and that resides in the actual muscle. So if you reduce the number of capillaries, then of course you're going to reduce the amount of oxygen being delivered to your muscle, okay? So that showed up within 4 to 8 weeks of endurance cyclists. So basically after 2 weeks of detraining, athletes present about a 7% decrease in VO2 max, which translates to about 0.5% of VO2 max decrease per day. So as an endurance athlete, that's concerning. It concerns me, okay? I work hard to maintain a high level of VO2 max, and your athletes do the same. So 0.5% per day, if you put this in perspective, over, say, a 2-month period where COVID-19 quarantine had us all staying inside, basically, avoiding human contact. If you looked at over that 2-month period of time, it is potentially that the athletes that we are helping may see up to an order of 30% decrease in VO2 max. That's significant. And we're going to go in a little bit more about that. But if you look at this in a broader perspective, if I look at your respiratory system impacts from the pandemic, just realize that just a few days of interruption of detraining, theoretically, the evidence suggests that your athlete would have experienced some diminished oxygen pathways to the cardiovascular and respiratory system, okay? All right, the last system I want to speak about is the muscular system. So what was the impact to our athletes from the pandemic from just sitting around? So your body sits around, so what happens to your muscles, okay? This is significant. Essentially, the evidence indicates that muscular detraining occurs following about 2 weeks of diminished training stimuli. Again, it doesn't have to be total cessation. It can just be an interruption, if you will, or diminished amount of training. So you'll start seeing some detraining impacts within 2 weeks. So again, it's the cause of this detraining specifically was the number of capillaries, the reduction in the number of capillaries that exists in your muscles. And again, that decreases the amount of oxygenated blood to the actual working muscle. All right. So as an endurance athlete, in cyclists, runners, whatever sport it is that you have, that you're working with, which invokes or uses the aerobic energy system, which you really need a lot of oxygen, right? So long distance events. The type 2B muscle fibers, which are your slow twitch muscle fibers, there was a significant amount of capillary reduction to slow twitch fibers within the first 3 weeks. Okay, so if you look at it a little bit further, you can see after about 4 weeks, there was a significant conversion to make up for that loss of slow twitch fibers. There's a conversion of fast twitch muscle fibers that are now being converted to slow twitch. Now, this was specifically in cyclists and runners. Okay, again, talking about endurance athletes. So we have to convert our fast twitch muscles to our slow twitch muscles in order to keep up with this detraining. Effectively, what this means is that muscular decline, again, through impaired delivery of blood to the muscle fibers, okay? This is all significant. So muscular decline is probably more significant than the others. And then I also want to bring up something of importance. As we speak about muscular detraining and the effects that the pandemic potentially could have, is that ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is that actual magical juice, if you will, that is necessary for our muscles to work, all right? Your whole body converts carbs and fats and proteins, hopefully not too many proteins, but it converts it to ATP, adenosine triphosphate, so that the muscles can innervate, okay? So if you can't produce ATP, you're going to stop. That's what you're just going to stop performance. What this did show is that through detraining, that the muscle cell mitochondria, the mitochondria inside the cellular level of the muscle cells, actually decreased the production of ATP by about 28%, following about a 3-week detraining period in endurance athletes. So we want to make sure that we understand that the muscular impacts are real. And specifically, if you're going to have an injury, the odds are it's going to be muscular related. And that's been my experience so far. Of course, I'm in Middle Tennessee, and so we've been out of the pandemic for a while. And so returning to play right now is kind of, it's almost like everything's back to normal. Well, in triathlon, what I've experienced with people that I've been exposed with and have been interacting with is that I'm seeing a lot of tendon issues, a lot of tendonitis, and that makes perfect sense because of the very thing we just spoke about, is that they come out of a pandemic where they've lost that routine aerobic and a muscular system innervation through a lifestyle of working out, and that imbalance. What that has done is that's caused their muscles to weaken, to diminish. And so that load, if you will, in their mind, they're still strong. So they've taken off. And what has happened is that they may be able to do 2 or 3 workouts and get away with it, but they've not managed that return to play. And as a result, the load of that sustained endurance, running, cycling, whatever that is, the load on the muscle fibers, it can't hold it because it's not strong enough anymore. So that load has to be transferred to the tendon, and the tendon connects the muscle to the bone, of course. So now the tendons are getting stretched and torn. And so we're seeing a lot of that. Achilles tendons right now, because the calf muscles are very weak. I know we've seen plantar issues. Patella tendons are also a big issue right now within runners. So they're just returning to play too quickly. And so that injury now is because their muscular system has just not regained that strength that they need. And yet their mind, nothing's changed. So that's just one piece of evidence that I've seen so far. Any feedback? Anybody have any comments or questions?
Good afternoon. My name is Lori Sullivan, and I'm a professor at a community college in exercise science and sports management. And I am more or less listening to this so I know how to talk to my students. And plus, I'm also a mother and a grandmother. And I'm so involved in the youth organizations in my community. And what I am seeing is not so much the physical aspect of, I'm talking now younger children as opposed to college athletes and adults, but the mental aspect. They are at home. They are so tired of being on Zoom and conference calls or, learning, virtual. But because they want to be gaming, they're the Xboxes. So the laziness has, come into play. And at the same time, now they're expecting when they're allowed to be on the field or go back on the court, they aren't of the mindset that, oh, I have lost all of this work that I put into it before the pandemic.
Mhm.
So it's basically getting the youth to understand that you lose so much faster than what it took us to gain. So
Yes.
that is trying to get them to understand that at a young age is really hard, because they're not the committed athlete such as the Olympians and so forth, to get out there and try to find ways of staying active. So that was what I've run into more as a parent, trying to get these kids to get out there and get involved, and, as opposed to the, physical aspect.
Right. Yes. And the component of this presentation, I suppose, I just specifically have focused in on the adults because that's primarily where my background
Oh,
is.
right.
But you're exactly right, Lori, and thanks for sharing that. And, just through the observations and within the community, I've noticed the same exact things with our youth. We've been back, in Middle Tennessee for some time now at our youth programs. And I've not necessarily heard of any injuries related to this. So I'd be interested. Have you heard of any specific injuries that maybe you've heard about that are more so than others in your youth?
Myself, I'm trying to think. I'm outside of Philly, so I'm in, I'm in Pennsylvania, and now they're talking more. Now we're going back to where we were. We're now talking about the masks being put back on and so forth and so on.
Yes.
So, but basically, more injuries, like you had said, the tendons, not stretching. They've lost all the flexibility that they had gained previously. A lot of the coaches don't understand how vitally important stretching pre and post, workouts. So the kids are getting injured a little bit more because they're trying to fit in so much into little time for practices because of field usage and, the lack of fields or lack of courts. So basically it's more or less due to, flexibility, pulling things, and the kids forcing themselves to keep on going because they haven't played for so long.
Yes. Excellent points. And I would imagine that would be the common injuries as well as the tendons. Specifically with youth, I have, I'm concerned with the youth returning so quickly because we spoke about that emotional impact, and you did as well, that they are, in a sense, they're, with kids and with youth, they're so strong, right? And they have such a, there's so much energy. I wish I had that again, but there's so much energy that you have to manage that return safely. And I know even with some adults that I have that are big kids, they're just such an exuberance and such an enthusiasm to return to play. So especially with our young people, we've got to be mindful, and they've got to be constantly being reinforced that they cannot overdo it quickly. And we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. So thank you very much, Lori. So as we return to play, and we want to be safe about it, right? That's the whole point of what we're trying to do. There's some recommendations, and a lot of this may sound cliche, just, common sense. And truthfully, if you think about it, it really is. But specifically, science teaches us some things, and I wanted to bring it up to you, and perhaps help us to kind of guide this process as we guide our athletes back to play. First and foremost, simply just take it slow and steady. Go ahead, Naomi, click the next one. Thank you. So as we return to play, the time it takes to get back to where we were pre-detraining, all right, so pre-COVID-19, how long does that take us to get back to where we were before? Because that's the number one thing, right? We got to get back to where we were. So the time that requires athletes to get back to that level, it differs again amongst the athletes. And there's several factors as coaches, as teachers, as trainers, as mentors that we need to kind of a checklist, if you will. Just kind of think about these things as you're working with them. First of all, is the length of detraining. I told you a minute ago, you don't have to be down completely. You don't have to cease completely, just slight interruptions. Hey, if I'm unable to work out 5 times a week, I'm only down to 2 days a week. That's significant, but it's still detraining. So how long did that period take? So the length of detraining, the number of physiological changes. I mentioned that the number one problem I'm seeing is muscular decline, which translates to injury. Well, how many other things have changed? Did the heart rate max change to a point? VO2 max change too much? Heart rate variability. There's all these other measures and physiological changes that we have to monitor as well. So they could be, how long it takes is how big an issue, how many issues did they incur? Fitness level. We're going to talk about that specifically here in just a moment as coaches and trainers. But we need to be mindful that it depends. If they were in good fitness before and now they've kind of diminished in their fitness, and guess what? They've got to be told that, and we've got to work with them to get their fitness level back. So how much of their fitness was lost? That's a significant point. And then another thing of interest or something that we need to focus in on as coaches is that what is the actual requirements for the sport? Use the sport itself to kind of measure where they are. And that's kind of where I'll talk about that here in just a minute as well. So again, returning to play varies amongst your athletes. So as you're bringing the recreational athletes back together, okay? Cardiovascular remodeling occurs first. Yeah, so neat is that the evidence shows that if you get back into the routine, you're getting back into your lifestyle and you're feeling good and everything, you're going to see benefits immediately on your cardiovascular. Okay, you're going to see that those values return quicker, and possibly within the first 2 weeks, you're going to see some significant gains. That's a good news. All right. So, but the bad news is that it takes a little longer for your muscular strength, your muscular power, and your muscular endurance to take place. That's the problem as coaches. And I mentioned that a minute ago, is because you got a really strong engine. You got this really massive cardiovascular system working for you, but your muscles aren't quite ready. And then that's where injury hurts. Okay, that's where you're going to get hurt. So work with them. And we're going to talk about this in the protocol here in just a second, is how we get back to that. But the key point is get these people back, get your athletes back to a consistent consistency of training again. Okay, that's the focus. Wow, the last thing we want is that the pandemic impacts their life forever. We don't want that chronic effect to be excess body weight gain forever. We want them to get back on the boat. Although they've been kicked off, get them back on that boat. So consistency is the key. You own that responsibility as a coach and a trainer, okay? We talked about that sport-specific training or testing. Coaches and trainers, we should perform a battery of sport-specific tests to evaluate the level of detraining in order to make an effective plan to safely return them to competition without injury. Now, I'm not going to go into that because there's so many sports, but just realize that you own that as a coach and a trainer. You own that. So you need to work with that athlete to develop basically some tests to determine how much of an impact the pandemic had on them. But also you need to realize that you may have to get, in some cases, another medical approval. And this, don't discount that you may witness some medical issues that you may have to ask your athlete that you've been training for 5 years. They need another medical approval. Engage your athlete. And I state this because I think of everything I'm going to say right now is just getting in the mind and helping your athlete get their head wrapped around what they've got to do. Engage your athlete, set some agreeable goals and short-term goals with your athletes. Emphasize with these goals that you're preventing their injury, okay? Teach them to listen to their body. Again, this is common sense. But again, you've got such an enthusiasm and return to sport that they're gonna have a tendency to want to push, and then you've got to engage them and say, no, this is what we've agreed to. You own it, I own it. This is what you're going to do. So set those small short-term goals to help your athlete return safely. They're going to thank you. Trust me, they will in the long term. And most people are understanding, because as this last bullet shows, we have to assure that the moderation of these athletes, because the concept is let's overtrain now to compensate for the detraining. That's crazy. So we got to be patient. We got to emphasize that. That's exactly what I have seen, is that as we are coming out of this pandemic and everybody's back to full steam ahead, is that they're now saying, wow, I lost a lot of this fitness. So that means I've got to now increase my volume, 50%, 60% in order to make up for that. Ooh, that drives me crazy. And it's very scary because those are the people who are high risk of injury. Don't overtrain as an athlete. Don't overtrain, please, just to make up for that detraining. You'll be amazed at how quickly your body responds, okay? And you'll thank yourself later. So again, recommendations for safe play. This is kind of the overall, right? So common sense, just be engaged with your athlete. Be mindful of all those things that you work with your client and your athlete to bring them back to where they were. All right, so I put together a return to play protocol. Now, this is my adaptation. I know we're running close to time here. It's a return to play protocol that I came up with based off of a lot of different things that I've been reading. And there's a lot of return to play protocols, okay? And you can Google it and you can probably find half a dozen or more different ones. What I found was I just adapt them, and I came up with 5 stages. And again, this is backed, with evidence. So if we use this, if we use the 5 stages, the very first stage, and this, and you as the coach and you as the athlete, you have to determine where your athlete fits into what stage. So we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But the very first level, we need to make sure that they can do light training. So the FIT principle, if you all are familiar with FITT, right? FITT, frequency, intensity, time, and type. So what I've done is I've just identified a protocol that you should be able to follow, easily apply and prescribe to your athletes, okay? So the very first one, stage 1, frequency. Make sure your athlete can do at least 3 days a week minimum, all right? Consistently do 3 days a week minimum. Heart rate, intensity, keep that heart rate down. We don't want it to be high right now. This is the whole point. We want to reintroduce slowly and methodically and purposely and intentionally. The time of the workout, no more than 30 minutes at a time. The type, have them just simply walk, do a light jog, do some biking on a stationary bike. Do not do resistance training, no strengthening right now. Just simply reintroduce them, get their cardiovascular system working, get their body moving again, and get them built on a frequency of consistency. All right, then we go to stage 2. When we look at stage 2, it's light to moderate. So you can see what we're doing. I'm transitioning you into a little bit higher intensity. So what are we doing here? We're going to back the frequency down to 2 days a week. All right, just 2 days a week. But we're going to increase the intensity to about 80%. Again, heart rate a little higher. No more than 30 minutes again. But now we're going to introduce some different exercises. And this one, we're going to focus in on your body. All right, we're going to move your body. And this is exactly what we're trying to do. We've got the cardiovascular system working, it's improving. And now we need to hit those muscles, get that respiratory system, getting that oxygen to those blood, to your body, and having it do the actual performing. So movement exercises, running, body weight resistance. You may do a little circuit training, bring some hand weights in, do some medicine balls, whatever else you want to do. But focus in on body movements during this phase. All right, stage 3. Stage 3, moderate training. Now we're going to see some increasing. We're going to do 2 areas. Frequency of 2 days a week. We don't want to increase that yet. We want to keep that heart rate high, about 80%, no more of their heart rate max. But we're now, if you notice, that the time, this is endurance, right? We're trying to build endurance. So we're going to bump that component of time up by 15 minutes this time on this stage. So workouts, 45 minutes duration, no more, at least just 45 minutes and no more. 2 days a week, 80% intensity. Now we bring in the specific training, the complex training, the sports specific drills, the running. Now we do weight training. Okay, this is where we want to bring in the strengthening. We talked about that. I know a lot of us already, in the training world, we know that if you do the eccentric, that loading of the eccentric phase, that's where the most tissue damage occurs. That's where your weight, that's where your strengthening of that muscle is going to occur. So focus in on the slow return as you elongate that muscle. Okay, I won't go into that, but this is the phase that we want to introduce the moderate training in stage 3. Stage 4. In stage 4, we're now going from moderate to intense. So we're really getting close to them being back to normal. Again, 2 days a week. We want to make sure our athletes can do at least 2 days a week consistently, 80% heart rate max. But notice now we're doing 1 hour workouts. This is normal sports. This is running. This is sport, but no contact. Avoid your athlete having contact at this point because we don't want them to become injured because they're very susceptible at this time. So don't try to help them prevent injury by avoiding contact. Okay, so we've got that time component up to 60 minutes. They're really strong, we're really feeling good. We go to stage 5, and guess what? We're back to normal. So they're released, they're ready to go back to unrestricted competition and exercise. So again, the idea is that we methodically take them through stages. Intentionally, as a coach, as a trainer, you work with them setting goals in each of those stages and then have them return safely because we don't want them injured. Okay, you own where they go in that protocol. In my experience, every one of the triathletes that I have been involved with, all right, they go straight to stage 4. Okay, so they feel like they can go do an immediate 1 hour workout, and those are the ones that are getting injured. Okay, just want to let you know. So that's the mentality we have as triathletes. So we talked about that, and before I wrap this session up, because we got about 10 minutes to go, and I want to make sure we got enough time for question and answers, I want to bring up that there are red flags for COVID-19. We need to continue to realize that there's still an epidemic or still pandemic, right? We're still in it. We're not quite out of it yet, and we still have to manage these infection risks. So there's some red flags that we have to be mindful of. I'm not going to read them all to you. You see them there. There's 2 of them I want to specifically focus in on. The first one is excessive heart rate, prolonged heart rate recovery. Now you can do this. You're a coach, you're an athlete, you have the technology, you have the heart rate monitor, you have these things on your watch, wherever those things are, you can determine if you are experiencing excessive heart rate and prolonged heart rate recovery, okay? So again, be mindful of that. We saw how COVID-19 can impact abnormal heart rhythms. So certainly this is one I need to bring up as a point of emphasis. The second one, as a respiratory disease or infection, the shortness of breath and passing out becomes a significant issue as well. If our athletes are conditioned, they should not have a shortness of breath or passing out. So be mindful as coaches as you're working with them. But athletes and coaches, you have these 2 to be mindful of, and you own those as a team, okay? But you can read the rest of them at your convenience as well. There's a lot of research on this as well. So again, just want to emphasize, let's see, here we go. Yep, let's go ahead and get to the end. And then we'll open this up for some comments. So what are some main takeaway points from today? Again, I brought in initially, if you looked at it, I brought in all these impacts to us as just general population, general public, but also specifically to our athletes. There has been a physical and a mental health impact. All right, and the degree to which we will experience this differs amongst our athletes. You need to be aware of that as the coaches, you're helping them. Family impacts, those can impact an athlete's mental status, their financial impact. All right, so unfortunately, they may not have the money that they need to rejoin the gym or to take on a new race challenge. Fitness and nutrition, huge. All right, no more need to go into that. It speaks for itself. And then we showed the main takeaway points were those 3 physiological systems that were impacted physically. What happens to us when we sit around and do nothing, or we're impacted somewhat by the disruption of lifestyle, cardiovascular, respiratory, and our muscular. Another point, be slow and intentional during our return to play. Okay, I can't emphasize that enough, to be smart, help our athletes be smart. As an athlete, you be smart, set goals, follow a plan. If you don't have a plan, make a plan, work that plan. I gave you a really quick, simple one as a protocol. Use that as an outline, make that a plan, and work with make yourself a goal, or help your clients with your athletes, give them a goal in each of those stages. And then lastly, and certainly significantly at this point, as we are still in the pandemic, not quite post-pandemic, but be aware of those acute red flags, but also those chronic flags that are starting to show up, okay? And stay on top of the latest information regarding athletics, the athletic response and the athletic community's response with their athletes in COVID who have been infected with COVID-19. All right, so I have dumped a ton of stuff on you in 1 hour, less than that. And I tried to show you what evidence is out there, what the world of recreational sports is like with using the evidence from exercise science, from health science. I put all this together to help you as coaches and athletes be safe and be mindful of a good return to play in our post-COVID-19 world, hopefully soon. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to just kind of field some questions or some comments from people. I think I saw a chat pop up.
Yeah, we have a question in the chat. How long would you prescribe as a minimum duration for each stage?
So the good question. So in each of those, I had a frequency of 2 days per week. I'm going to probably say I would like to see someone perform at least 2 days a week, a frequency of about 3 weeks per. I know you think, wow, that's a 15-week return to play. Yep, that's probably about true. 2 months of a safe return, 2 to 3 months of return to play. That's normal. I would think that was acceptable. So I'm going to say 2 to 3 weeks. Now they're going to progress quickly. And you as the coach or as the athlete should be able to determine when you feel they're ready to progress and set a new goal. Okay. Again, the focus is frequency, consistency. So if there's one thing I've noted, and that is in training, is that people will start off strong and then they'll fall off. Okay, so the point I'm trying to emphasize in that plan is that they be consistent. All right, that has to be consistent. Good question. If you have questions about the presentation, or if you have additional questions about anything, regarding a return to play and safety, whatever, if you have a specific question regarding the program for that matter, at Concordia University, Chicago, I'm available. I've left my email address up there for you to contact me. I'd be more than happy to help. I love to help people with their health and their fitness, so and reaching their performance goals. So.
Great. If no one has any other ones, just wanted to say thank you so much, Todd, for presenting for us today. And thank you everybody who attended. Be sure to be registered for our other upcoming Return to Play webinars. You can go to returntoplayseries.com, make sure you're registered. And with that, thank you so much. We appreciate every one of you.
Thank you, everyone.